Hello again. I will be going over primary and secondary artifacts in PvP today. Before I start going over the artifacts, I wanted to mention some important info about casting artifacts that tons of players are blissfully unaware of. Casting an artifact is always dangerous in PvP, even if it's a defensive artifact. It's at least the same amount of risk as attacking someone with an encounter power. This is especially true if your opponent is a class with a lot of fast cast times on their powers. I've lost count of how many times I've been able to land a big, juicy encounter hit on people by attacking them mid-artifact cast. I've done this versus Anvil, in Venom's Journal, etc. Likewise, you can also use this info yourselves to land more attacks. You can often predict when someone is going to cast an artifact and hit them mid-cast. Now, with that out of the way, let's go over the very best primary slot artifacts for PvP. As you can see, the text block in the corner there, as you can see in the text block in the corner there, these artifacts are in Venom Storyteller's Journal, Gon's Anvil of Creation, and Wheel of Elements. These three artifacts are the big three that almost everyone uses right now. In Venom Storyteller's Journal currently is only best in slot for rogues and possibly healers. This artifact can perform well on other classes, but most people on other classes find they are too fragile when they run this artifact. In Venom Storyteller's Journal is a multi-purpose artifact. It increases your damage, it gives you a lot of action points, it briefly stuns enemies, and it also deals a little bit of damage directly. Especially at the end when the dragon explodes. That can kill low health people. If you are a returning player, in Venom Storyteller's Journal is basically just a stronger version of Sigil of the Cleric. To ensure maximum daily gain per match from your Envenomed Journal, you could cast your Envenomed Storyteller's Journal the moment it becomes ready every single time. You can also save your journal and cast it when you enter fights. Situationally, this can be good as well. I'd say that's probably the best for straight damage. You can also cast in Venom Storyteller's Journal defensively, using the CC effect from it. I personally do this a lot. You can also use the CC effect from it to increase the odds of successfully trapping somebody in a larger CC effect, such as Smoke Bomb. A few words of caution about using in Venom Storyteller's Journal, though. You want to avoid casting it when you are going to die before its effects have had time to do much. You also need to be aware of the hierarchy of control effects when trying to use its CC effect. If your enemy uses a stronger CC effect like a Blast Scepter or a T-Rex, your Envenomed Journal stun is not strong enough to match this. Your enemy will gain the upper hand because your CC effect doesn't last long enough compared to theirs. And to be more specific about what I mean by that, if you're going against somebody in, say, a 1 versus 1, and they've got a Blast Scepter or a T-Rex, and you've got an Envenomed Journal, and you try to counter their T-Rex with your Envenomed Journal, or their Blast Scepter, whichever one it is, then your journal is just going to get overpowered by it. Like, their stun's going to last a little bit longer, so they will gain the upper hand in that situation. So, versus that, like, when you're basically playing rock, paper, scissors like that, the Envenomed Journal will get beaten by the Blast Scepter or the T-Rex. Notably, Envenomed Storyteller's Journal can throw off dueling results if you are trying to 1 versus 1 someone who doesn't have this artifact. A rogue going against a barbarian, for example, will have the upper hand. This upper hand is even more prominent if the rogue is running Envenomed Storyteller's Journal. This is because the rogue will keep winning from getting their daily ready. This same advantage posed by Venom Storyteller's Journal can also apply to 1 versus 1s versus other classes. and also 4 other classes. Next up, we have Gon's Anvil of Creation. This artifact is best in slot on most classes right now. It is a very strong and easy to use defensive artifact. It has a 30-second uptime and a temporary HP shield that refreshes every few seconds. 3 seconds to be specific. Notably, the tooltip for this artifact is wrong. It says the artifact uptime is 15 seconds, but it's really 30 seconds. I tested that today again to be sure. To attack through in order to attack through an enemy's Gon's Anvil of Creation, you need to get the temporary HP out of the way with a smaller attack and then quickly hit them with a larger attack. You'll need to keep up constant pressure on that enemy until their Gon's Anvil runs out. Either that, or you'll need to deal enough damage to reduce someone to 0 HP and go through their temp HP as well. Your other option is to wait for the artifact's effects to end before attacking with your important stuff. Notably, rogues can also use Gon's Anvil of Creation, even though they usually don't. It's quite good on rogue right now if the rogue alternates between spamming Clad of Steel and Gloaming Cut to manually refill their action points. At-will spam in general is a try-hard way for a rogue to get a lot more AP. Like, I don't do this much right now, but if you're trying to get the most out of your rogue, then in general you want to spam at-wills a lot more than I do in the videos that you see. And you especially want to do that if you are using a Gon's Anvil of Creation, because you'll be tankier, so you'll be able to survive better while using those at-wills. And also, because you're not getting the free action point gain from the Envenomed journal, you would want to use the Gon's Anvil of Creation. You'd want to use the at-will spam to fill in for that when using a Gon's Anvil of Creation, so your dailies are still being generated at a high enough rate. The last of the 3 artifacts is Wheel of Elements. This artifact takes the most skill to use out of these 3 options. The water and earth buffs are the ones that you want. The other 2 bonuses are not very good. The water buff is the very best buff, so if you can, you want to take this one. If you can't take that one, you take the earth buff. Usually DPS classes don't slot this artifact themselves. They could, but instead they usually let a support angle their character in such a way that this correct buff spawns directly on top of them. Some of you may have seen Azu doing that. Things can get chaotic though, and it's not always possible for a player running this artifact to drop the water buff directly on top of you. Sometimes they just have to cast the artifact on the ground normally and hope you are smart enough to run into the correct buff. If you jump forwards while casting this artifact, you'll always land in the fire buff. You don't want to do this anymore since the fire buff is really weak compared to all of the other buffs. If I remember right, the order of whether the user or their teammates takes their buff first matters. I think the caster is supposed to let their teammates take their buffs first before taking any of the buffs themselves. I can't remember for sure though, so I recommend testing this artifact before you run into PvP with it. As a word of caution, this artifact is the riskiest to activate out of the 3. If an enemy sees you cast it, they could try to push you into the wrong buff using something like a lion or a fighter prone or numerous other things. If you are trying to use this artifact on yourself, you will be vulnerable while you are rushing to stand in the correct buff, and it's possible someone who doesn't need it will blunder into the buff you wanted instead of you. Now, there are 3 more good artifacts that could turn out to be best in slot in some cases. Frozen Storyteller's Journal is a very strong defensive artifact, and it does increase your damage sum as well. It summons NPC dwarves, which you and your teammates can use to make it much harder for enemies to hit you. It also puts a safe zone on the ground that you and your teammates can stand in for some damage resistance. That zone is pretty big, but it's also hard to see the border of it usually. As a word of caution, Frozen Storyteller's Journal can be a cancer artifact that a lot of people will complain about if too many people are using them at once. This is because items that summon NPCs in general are widely hated in PvP. I mean, you've probably seen people complain about mirage weapons and other items like it. A while back, Dark Storyteller's Journal was doing a massive amount of damage. Probably this has been fixed, but it may still be worth testing to see if it's still good. I have heard a rumor that this artifact still does more damage than in Venom's Journal, but I don't know that for sure. It wasn't something that got in any further testing that I know of. Now, there's another artifact. Howisters' Blast Scepter in this meta is not as strong as the other artifacts I've listed thus far, but it is strong enough that it doesn't really belong in the second best artifact table either. So, Howisters' Blast Scepter is a strong stun, and it also comes with a really nice 15% damage boost. You can use it to stun someone long enough to land an important encounter or mount hit. A lot of Whisper Knife rogues used to run this artifact. Your teammates also will benefit from the damage boost from this artifact. For returning players, Howisters' Blast Scepter is basically a better Soulsight Crystal. The damage buff from Blast Scepter is smaller than the one from Crystal, but it is still a better artifact overall than Soulsight Crystal is. The stun from Blast Scepter last time it was tested was undodgeable, but this was tested a long time ago, and I'm now not so sure this artifact is still undodgeable. I think I've witnessed a wizard dodge it before recently, but it's hard to say for sure. They could have just been CC immune from the 4-stack system in PvP. Also, don't use this artifact to try to land the Toad mount. Toad is already undodgeable, so it is a waste to use your Blast Scepter stun to land a Toad hit. Even though it does boost the damage as well, you're better off using that as part of an encounter rotation. Good players usually use Blast Scepter to land important encounter hits instead. Like, for example, a Whisper Knife would be using this artifact to land Shadow Strike. You could use this artifact to land one of the dodgeable mounts like TV as well and buff it a little bit, but even this isn't the best way to use it. The best way to use it is usually going to be to use it to land an important encounter hit that's a staple of your rotation. Moving on to the alternative artifact options. These are good options for players who don't have anything better to use yet. Wyvern Venom coated knives is a good damage buffing artifact. It sprays daggers out in a fan, and all enemies hit will take more damage. This artifact also applies a small DOT effect. This DOT effect is good for killing Soulforged users. The dot doesn't go on. The dot does not go through the Soulforged immunity frame, but it will resume ticking when the Soulforged immunity frame wears off. You'd cast Wyvern Knives close to the end of the immunity frame or right after the immunity frame has ended for best results. Next up, the DOT from Staff of Flowers is much weaker than it used to be, but this artifact is still decent. It still buffs your teammates' stats, and it still inflicts a really strong slow effect on your enemies. As a history lesson, Staff of Flowers used to do a lot of damage from its DOT effect back in Mod 19. It was commonly used by rogues in combination with Smoke Bomb and the Wings Mount in order to wipe out entire teams. Now obviously, like I said, this artifact has been nerfed, but in case the meta ever shifts again, you might want to know that that DOT could become stronger. Next up we have Ugma's Token of Free Movement. This is still a decent defensive artifact. Its 6-second immunity frame was so strong last time I tested it, it was like, you could even remove the slow effect from Courage Breaker. So it's got a 6-second CC immunity frame, and it's such a strong immunity frame that it was able to remove the slow effect from the Courage Breaker Rogue Daily power. Now, I have not tested it in a long time, but probably nothing has changed with how it works. Next up we have Soulsight Crystal. Soulsight Crystal is the largest damage buff provided by any artifact. It is still outclassed by Howisters Blast Scepter in spite of this though. Glass Cannon builds might still find a use for this artifact. As some words of caution, Soulsight Crystal has a disorienting animation. It turns your screen teal for its duration, which makes it harder to use than most other artifacts. This artifact also only increases your damage versus the enemy you targeted when you cast it, and your teammates don't benefit from this buff. Next up we have Sigil of the Cleric. Now, Sigil of the Cleric is very similar to in Venom Storyteller's Journal in that it grants a lot of action points over time. But in Venom's Journal grants slightly more action points, and it does a lot more things than Sigil of the Cleric does. Sigil of the Cleric is still a good option for people who don't have a journal, but are in need of more action points. Next up we have Shard of Valendra's Crown. Shard of Valendra's Crown is still a decent artifact. It grants you damage immunity and CC immunity for the entire duration of the animation. It also does a knockback effect on the second hand swipe. This artifact is easy to counter, but it can still be good against enemies that don't encounter this artifact very much or aren't paying attention. Thirst here is probably the most difficult artifact to wield in PvP out of all artifacts. Even the smallest control effect will cancel it, and it's got a long animation. The terrain also needs to be really smooth or this artifact will snag. That all said, this artifact is still good in the hands of a really experienced player who is using it for the hell of it, I suppose. This artifact, when cast successfully, allows you to cover a lot of distance really quickly. It also comes with a damage buff. This artifact can also be animation cancelled to apply the debuff without the launch effect. If no enemies are hit, you can cast the animation visuals over and over, and you do the animation cancelling by dodging usually. Moving on to secondary slot artifacts. The very best secondary slot artifacts are the journal artifacts, Storyteller's journals. Running 3 of these is best in slot if your build can afford to do it. Usually, players purposely leave off the darkened Storyteller's journal since you usually need a different artifact in your 4th slot more, and the Darkened Journal stats are inferior to the ones from newer artifacts, such as the Wyvern Venom coated knives, or if you're trying to run a artifact 3 set bonus, then you would also want to prioritize that artifact 3 set bonus over running something like a Darkened Storyteller's Journal. If you run an artifact in your primary slot that is not a journal artifact, you will have to choose between having an artifact gear 3 set bonus and having the journal 3 set bonus. You can only have one or the other in that case. You can still obtain the journal 3 set bonus even if your journals don't have any pages in them. Like if you look at the tooltips here, you can see I have all of the pages for mine. But for a lot of people, they don't have all the pages because they bought their journal artifacts off the auction house, but were not aware that there needed to be specific pages that are only available as part of events in order to make their artifacts work as primary slot artifacts. So if you're one of those players who didn't know this, and you have a bunch of zeros instead of a bunch of 1-1s on your pages for your artifact, then that means that your artifact, it's not going to work in a primary slot artifact. It will have no effects. But it will still grant you the 3 set bonus for equipping it in secondary slots. Now, if you don't have the journals, there are several other good options you could use instead. One of these other options is to run the newer artifacts. Like the ones that have a high item level and good stats. The best of these is usually Wyvern Venom coated knives. And other options include the Sword of Zariel, the Howisters Blast Scepter, the Arcturia's Music Box, Demogorgon's Reach, and also Staff of Flowers. Now, another good option is to run 3 times Dragonheart artifacts. Having 3 Dragonheart artifacts reduces your cooldowns by 10%. These artifacts used to be really cheap and were popular for players looking for the cheapest way to make a viable PvP character. Now, they have gotten more expensive since then, so keep that in mind. Like, these artifacts used to be worth dirt, but if I go onto the auction house here, you can see these are pretty expensive artifacts now. Like, they're all within the 500k range or above. These used to be worth like maybe 5k each, but now they're worth quite a bit more. Not the cheapest way to gear up anymore, but if you ever had a need to run Dragonhearts, then you could consider them. Now, Dragonhearts are a possible option for bards, and they're also good on budget-friendly Whisper Knife builds. Keeping in mind you'll probably be a bit fragile and your HP will be a bit low with these on compared to something like journals. So they're probably not best in slot for anybody, but they are a decent option, especially if that's what you had already. Now there is one more secondary slot artifact option. This is not as good as the other options I've listed already, but this last option is, like, it's to stack the old artifacts that grant 7.5% stamina gain. If you look here, I've got one of those here. The best of these in terms of stats is the Sigil of the Hunter. Notably, Gon's Anvil of Creation also grants the 7.5% stamina like this. That is everything important, guys. See you next time.